Greetings, Archivist. This is Agent Gray of the Department of Metacognition. I'd like to have a chat if you have a moment. My recent assignments have had me delving into apocalyptic scenarios. Through this, I have had a bit of a revelation. Zombies as a world ender do not make much sense. Now, don't get me wrong, as a tool of horror, reflecting our dread of forced conformity, of the loss of self, of consumerism, contagions on the frailty of civilization, and of course, as a reminder of our own mortality, they are fascinating. But as a threat to society, they fail at the most basic level. Now, for the purposes of this archive, we consider a zombie to be a formerly sentient being who can best be characterized by three negative states: the loss of higher cognition, a suspension of self-preservation instincts, and the loss of agency or control over one's actions. The cause of this condition differs across timelines and universes, but generally falls into one of four categories. The first, the necrotic, the reanimation of the dead. The second, the virion, a transformation caused by a virus or chemical pathogen. The parasitic, caused by an invasive life form integrating into the host neural system. And finally, the supernatural, derived by magic, necromancy, or some divine or devilish artifact. Now to the point. Why do I consider zombies a failed world ender? Well, the first major issue is their biological factors. All life exists within a delicate balance between energy consumed and energy exerted. In all forms of zombie, save for the supernatural, this balance becomes skewed and sets the creature on a path of terminal decline. As a direct result, regardless of the cause of their zombification, every model is subject to distinct failings of their physical form. For the necrotic, once the heart stops beating, the clock starts ticking. At death, the body enters a state of rigor mortis. Without the generation of new ATP, adenosine triphosphate, or some other energy source, the muscles cannot be relaxed, effectively locking this new zombie in place. Any attempt at movement would result in their muscles being torn apart. If we assume that they wait until the muscles relax as a result of autolysis, their body would have the structural soundness of wet cardboard. This is just the beginning of their issues, however. We must also consider the impact of their physical degeneration on their sensory systems. Within days of their reanimation, their eyes would liquefy due to their circulatory system pooling blood in lower areas of the body. Yet to the subject, they would have gone blind long before from a simple failure to blink. Without tear production, the cornea would desiccate and crack. Their hearing, too, would be destroyed by their body's decay, a combined effect of the cessation of earwax production leading to the embrittling of the eardrum, and autolysis leading to the dislocation of the ossicles, tiny bones necessary to our hearing. Naturally, as decomposition occurs, gas builds up within the body. This leads to a swelling of tissue within the ears, particularly blocking the eustachian tubes. This, combined with the accumulation of purge fluid, a breakdown of internal organs, kind of slush, and any hearing would be muddled. But even if we were to assume that the physical structures were to remain intact, the neural pathways for hearing are highly reliant on oxygen and the metabolic process, a breakdown of which, caused by the subject's initial death, would see this area suffer an irreversible degradation, effectively meaning the brain could not process any of the incoming signals as sound, leaving them deaf to their surroundings. And we should also consider that any sense of smell that they might possess would be drowned in the scent of their own putrefaction. Under the best-case scenario, they would exist in a cool, dry environment, and there the body might remain upright for 2 weeks. But even then, without blood flow, the synovial fluid that lubricates our joints would vanish. Every step would become a grinding process of bone against bone. Within miles, their cartilage would be shredded beyond use. Their bones would be ground down to a useless powder, and as a result, within a matter of days, the necrotic variant would be rendered a blind, deaf creature whose every movement would further degrade their capacity. A far cry from some great predator. Next, we must consider the so-called living dead. Infected beings whose biological drive have been warped to serve another interest, whether this is as a result of a mutant strain of rabies, a general chemical-induced psychosis, or as a result of the will of some parasitic organism. In many ways, these beings would suffer an even harsher biological red line than necrotic zombies. In order for their body to remain functional, it would require specific inputs, namely food, water, oxygen, and the likes. These are necessary for the body to generate energy and for its various processes to remain functional. Unfortunately for these zombies, the virus or parasite disrupts the body's regulatory systems and replaces its thinking with an overwhelming compulsion to feed. This suggests that this form of zombie would consume anything that it could get its hand on. Wild game, bugs, pets, loved ones, even one another. Now, some sources have even suggested amongst this variant a willingness to cannibalize themselves or their host to achieve its goals, though that may be as a result of the host unit starving. This compulsion, then combined with their inability to use technology, their lack of a capacity to cook, raises the threat that they may ingest a veritable cocktail of secondary viruses and possibly other parasites. To say nothing of the dangers of consuming contaminated flesh or prions disease or anything of that sort. These secondary viruses or parasites would then overwhelm the body's already failing immune system and lead to systemic organ failure and thus ultimately the death of the host. Even more immediate is their need for water. Just as they are unable to cook, it's unlikely that they would maintain the capacity to operate a faucet. Even if we assume they could, such infrastructure in a truly world-ending scenario would be rendered inoperative. Nor then does it seem likely that they would be able to discern a clean water source, rendering them either subject to contaminants in their water, which again brings us back to our previous issue of ingesting parasites or other detritus, fecal matter, what have you, that would then induce further issues on their immune system, or they would be forced to go without water, thus suffer kidney failure within 72 hours. Additionally, as these units are operating largely within baseline human needs, they would be equally at the mercy of their environment as any other survivor. Whether it's a burning heat or a stifling cold, they could suffer from dehydration, excessive sweating, they could suffer from hypothermia and the likes. But it should be noted, as their immune system is likely not fully defeated when they experience the zombification, and it continues to battle the virus or parasite within the body would experience feverish spikes in temperature. Spikes that in a healthy human could be offset through sweating or vasodilation, the dilation of blood vessels. Faced with their present condition, such regulatory systems would likely be lost or subsumed to the parasite or the virus. And then, should their internal temperatures spike above 107 degrees Fahrenheit or 41.7 degrees Celsius, the proteins of the brain would break down, losing all shape and function. Now, in addition to everything that we've just mentioned with the Virion variant, the parasite also has some unique failings to consider. So regardless of whether or not the parasite is some fungus or an extra-dimensional crab or some other such entity, the parasite is achieving its sustenance at the expense of its host. Effectively, the longer the parasite is attached, the weaker the host organism becomes. Some of these parasite models will offset structural failings of their host by replacing host cells with their own, but this too presents issues. First, it's going to require a great deal of energy to grow and establish such a high rate of cellular turnover or remodeling of the host body, an extent that is beyond the typical human digestive system to achieve. Second, many parasitic organisms are environmentally limited or incapable of surviving in various environments. The more they replace the baseline subject, the more exposed they become to environmental factors, which would limit their overall efficacy. In order for this method to be effective, they would need regular access to new victims, biomass, or they will simply die out as a species. All of which comes together to suggest that the notion of some massed horde moving in concert is nothing more than pure fantasy. In their deranged, desperate state, I would suggest that they are far more likely a threat to one another than they are to any survivor. I would go so far as to state that this apocalypse would be a self-terminating affair, one that would last barely over 3 weeks, depending largely on environmental and metabolic factors. Now finally, for our 4 types, we do have to consider the supernatural variety. These are perhaps the most dangerous variant, with their efforts often being coordinated by some malevolent intelligence. Their forms and movements are supported by magic and do not require any direct input to function. Yet, like all the previously discussed forms, they are subject to a critical biological weakness that would reduce their effectiveness to negligibility. The first of which is their guiding intelligence, whether it's a totem, an artifact, an individual, whatever it may be that is guiding their movements, presents a single point of failure that should, at any point in the apocalypse, it be destroyed, so too would be every horde it has raised. Now, admittedly in their favor, identifying, finding, and destroying such an artifact or person would perhaps be the greatest find a needle in the haystack event the world has ever seen. Fortunately for survivors and sentient beings, this is not their only weakness. Consider the state of these zombies that are preserved by magic, or but through some other unnatural means. While they are alive, they are mobile, they are capable, it's clear from the damage that has been inflicted upon their body, this presence of decay and disrepair, that this is not some regenerative magic that is keeping them functional, and thus any sort of engagement with survivors or with the environment would over time reduce their capabilities. Imagine, if you will, a zombie encounters a grenade. The concussive force may tear limbs from their body, exposing their inner organs, etc. They may still be operational, but are they as effective as before? Finally, their exposed innards would prove a mobile buffet for anaerobic bacteria and carrion insects. In fact, the relative state of all zombies would present to wildlife an easy source of food and protein that they're unlikely to find anywhere else. And we do have to consider that sentient beings, human beings, do not exist in an ecological vacuum. The only advantage these zombies would really have over wildlife is their lack of self-preservation, where a wild critter may run off if threatened, if injured. The zombie itself would do no such thing. And even if we were to assume through some means that the virus were to cross the zoonotic bridge, human zombies would then likely be relegated to the bottom of this new food chain, competing with creatures with superior claws, teeth, and speed, and humanity's real evolutionary advantage being destroyed in the process of zombification. Put simply, there are too many biological variables working against them. More crudely, while they might not have amounted to shit in life, they certainly will in death. Let's move on to the secondary point of failure: means of transmission. Depending upon the specific universe, zombification is spread via a bite. Fluid transmission, a aerosolized transmission, or through a universal infection state. If we consider the bite as the primary means of transmission, it would be a catastrophe for the pathogen. It relies on an element of uncertainty and surprise amongst would-be victims. This would suggest that the initial transmission is likely to be highest among primary kinship groups, loved ones, if you will, as their hesitancy to act would provide an opening for the undead. Then it becomes a race. How quickly does the pathogen incubate within its new host? An instantaneous transformation would increase the immediate efficacy of the unit transformed, as the host would be largely intact. Additionally, the rapid nature of this transformation, combined with the surprise of such changes, would allow for more individuals to be transformed, and thus increasing the potential vectors by which zombification spreads. The most glaring weakness of this rapid conversion event is that in an era of high technology and near instantaneous communication, once that first video is uploaded, any element of surprise evaporates. The second option, a delayed transformation, would allow a longer period of movement, which would carry the pathogen, whatever form it takes, beyond the initial outbreak zone. Individuals could travel with others, with family members, and because they are surviving together, living together, that closeness could provide a new avenue for zombification. However, once the conditions are recognized, the fever in the host, their decaying mental faculties, and a physical decline, those would all be clear signs. And groups, assuming they act rationally, and even more certainly amongst the terrified and irrational, a distrust-first mindset would recognize the threat for what it is. Of course, the true weakness of biting as a path of transmission comes from its intimate nature. An infected host must be within extremely close range. As a result, humanity's primary evolutionary defense would not be a strictly biological immune response, though it is certainly possible that one could be developed depending on the exact causation for zombification, but rather it would be their spatial awareness and adaptive flight. Most individuals are not going to stand around when someone or something comes stumbling towards them aggressively. They will flee, or they will fight. And through the use of improvised weaponry or greater physical control of their bodies, they could fairly easily mitigate the zombies' efforts to get within biting range. To say nothing of the use of projectile technology, say firearms or bows and arrows, which render this means of transmission moot. Of a greater danger would be the messy nature of combating the undead. Their purge fluids, blood splatter, and perhaps even aerosolized spores, posing a microbial threat to the living. But even these can be readily mitigated through the use of personal protection equipment, respirators, goggles, and waterproof layers. This would provide effective shielding for both mucous membranes and any skin abrasions that exist. Further, once that gore has been expelled from the host organism, it would begin to dry. The loss of moisture to the surrounding environment would render the pathogen inert within hours. Even quicker if the sentient were to use a basic soap or a bleach solution, as most high-mortality pathogens are enveloped in a lipid layer and are themselves quite fragile to the environment. As for those that might release spores or other aerobiological materials, this too would be of limited effectiveness. While certainly dangerous in confined and poorly ventilated spaces, spores in an open environment would be subject to the effects of wind dilution, which, as the name suggests, would part the spore clouds over a wider area. And they themselves, being subject to gravity, would be somewhat limited in their dispersal. Upon landing in the soil, they would be subject to indigenous bacteria, which, across the planet, is specialized in consuming foreign organic material. Now, we must also consider then the potential for the universal infection scenario. These are timelines where the pathogen is already widespread, where every death, regardless of its cause, triggers reanimation. Here too, it would still fail to end the species. If we were to look at humanity in particular, humans are experts at normalizing the macabre. When this becomes an expected or even anticipated event, society itself may change, be transformed, but would it really be that much different than changing societal norms or the adoption of new technologies or new materials into our daily lives? Were I to speculate, I would say you might see changes in how society processes grief, turning it from a private affair into a public safety program. Building codes might be adjusted to ensure that every entryway may be controlled, functioning like an airlock to prevent access from without or the release of the dead from within. New policies of restraining the patients during surgeries or those in hospice care, changes to death certificates verifying the neutralization of the individual, and for insurance companies requiring post-mortem processing. Workplace safety programs would need to be updated, and paramedics or EMTs would effectively be part medic and part animal control in their performance of duties. Even so, I would not think civilization would fall to a predictable post-death twitch. Now, as a final note, we must of course address the uncooperative prey. For any species to fall to the living impaired, it would require a total cessation of adaptive intelligence. Most sentients, when faced with aggressive and non-verbal threat, will instinctively leverage their adaptability and intelligence, securing their position against the threat, fleeing from it, or fighting against it, improvising armaments to keep their foe at range or to potentially scare it off. While kinship dynamics may initially be exploited, cynicism or cynical detachment would likely become the norm as people cope with the increased stress scenarios that they are placed in, hardening the overall society. More decidedly, the notion of a horde overwhelming organized military or police forces, I would say, is nothing more than a tactical fantasy. First, because as I mentioned earlier, a horde forming in and of itself is highly unlikely. But even if it were, modern military tactics are designed for high-intensity, long-range engagements between mechanized forces, which renders the bite as a vector of transmission impossible. Additionally, through the use of thermobaric, high-explosive weaponry, the zombies' form would be obliterated at range, and through the use of advanced drones, either packed with explosives or armed with firearms, the military could engage zombies without risking any lives. And second, while a Battle of Yonker scenario is quite plausible in the sense that the military may need to adapt tactics for a threat that behaves in a manner unusual to any combatant nation, the battle was a failure of imagination, not a failure of arms. The reality is, any engagement would not be combat in the traditional sense, but more an extreme sanitation issue. For, again, as I mentioned long ago at the very beginning of this diatribe, even if the zombie feels no pain, even if they feel no fear, that makes no difference to a 5.56mm round going through your clavicle. That makes no difference to an explosive removing your legs. You're still going to be rendered combat ineffective. Shrapnel can still destroy signals between the necrotic brain and the limbs, preventing movement. So while technically you might argue that the form may remain alive, is that really relevant if it's not able to act on its impulses? If we are to consider the Raccoon City incident, then we do need to consider the greatest threats to civilizational survival. Panic, institutional decay, and logistical constraints. The targeted and planned nature of the outbreak led to a rapid infection of the public. This contributed to a breakdown in response, exacerbated by corrupt and sabotaging leadership. Well, that and the introduction of specialized bioorganic weaponry that vastly exceeds the baseline undead. However, we must distinguish between a localized perfect storm and a global extinction event. The Raccoon City incident succeeded only because it occurred within a closed system, a company town, if you will, where every layer of the defense, from the water table to the chief of police, was compromised from the onset. As a model for a global apocalypse, it fails the test of scalability. Once the surprise of the initial outbreak is spent, the geographic isolation of such incidents allows the surrounding uninfected infrastructure to mobilize. A single city may fall to institutional decay, but a species defined by predatory dominance and long-range ballistic capabilities does not simply forget how to sanitize a biological threat once the panic subsides and the logistics of waging war are mobilized. If we were to look at subsequent events following the fall of Raccoon City, we would see a series of biological outbreaks, in Africa, in China. But does that mean humanity fell? No. In short, to believe in the zombie apocalypse being possible is to believe that humanity would forget 10,000 years of predatory dominance to a creature that is already dead. A creature that is outcompeted by bacteria and carrion insects, by the environment, wildlife, and their own frail biological forms, by the capability of modern sentience to communicate the danger, and by the tools we have perfected in killing one another for the past several millennia. In this agent's opinion, this case is closed. I await your response. Agent Gray, signing off.